Hello, welcome to another episode of The Meaning Tent, discussing the work of Stan Tenen. Today we're going to have a little fun. We're going to go through some of the posters in the book, and other sources. Sorry for the little yellow tabs, but if you have this book, you already know that it's chock full of graphics. I think there's over 200 illustrations in here. Mm-hmm. And I would say 90 to 95% of them were crafted by Stan himself, which makes his role as a researcher even more amazing because of his ability to absorb information and disseminate it in such a clear and concise way. Doesn't mean you're going to understand it, but if you spend time with it, you'll see that there's a method to his madness, as the expression goes. So what we're going to do today is we're going to choose a poster, or let me also add that the posters, each poster tells a story, and obviously in the book, Stan tells that story. But you can take a section of a poster and it tells a story in itself. And we're going to be doing that also in some cases. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, Levanah, you wanted to discuss another topic that kind of is the umbrella to all of this. So why don't you lead off and go ahead with your ideas.
Okay. As anybody who has explored our material realizes, Stan was a visualizer. And he could visualize in, certainly 3 and even 4 dimensions pretty readily. So if you have explored his book or our website, you'll see a whole lot of visual stuff, some of which may look confusing at first. He based a lot of his visual work on what he called geometric metaphor. And I realized when I was looking for a poster to try and explain that first I probably need to explain what he meant by geometric metaphor and why those of you who are prickly about math don't need to have to worry about the word geometry, okay? For him, geometric metaphor was a way of systematically visualizing the relationship between ideas which were related. And it gave him a structure to explore. It doesn't have much to do with the kind of geometry that you got taught in high school or junior high. Other than that we're dealing with physical things. And a way to think of geometry and why that works is that, in a sense, because we live in a 3-dimensional physical world, we live embedded in geometry. It's something that ultimately, as creatures who live here, we have that in common. Even if nothing else, we have that in common. And so it's a way of exploring ideas that can be translated from one culture to another or from one embodiment to another. So that is kind of the approach that my husband took. And as it turns out, some of the material that Michael picked and some of the material that I picked kind of dovetail a bit. One of the basic metaphors, geometric metaphors that we used wound up being a way of describing the interplay between this physical world, the earth plane that we live in, and our relationship to something transcendent, something that is infinite, something that is unpredictable, something that just comes. The metaphor that we use is, we tend to call it the inverted T. And sometimes we print it and use it in terms of a triangle, like this one in the middle here. That's just one of the ways we embody it. The book talks about this a lot. The poster that got my interest was one which deals with the difference between linear time as we experience it from birth to childhood to adulthood to seniorship to, what
Passive.
Yeah.
Follows.
Linear time, and what we think of as cyclic time, the cycle of the seasons. If you're religious, the cycle of the religious year, the cycle of the stars in the sky and how they progress, which is also the same thing as the cycle of the seasons when you think about it. Something which is basically predictable, happens, comes around all the time. And a good metaphor for that, it's like, you can also, think about what comes around goes around. What goes around comes around. This relates to a way of embodying the golden rule. What goes around comes around, the wheel of karma, something which is basically fixed. But then you have what Stanley would call as above, so below, that the injection of novelty into that cycle, it happens. It's the occurrence of a completely unpredictable miracle, something unpredictable, something that just happens, something that changes everything. And you'll probably notice that I'm making gestures as I'm trying to explain this thing, which is so basic to my thinking after all these decades, but which Stanley could articulate much better than in a more organized way than I have yet learned to do.
We do have videos where he has done that.
Yes, and I highly recommend you see them. Something that I think that we can progress to doing with this, we used to publish a newsletter called the eTaurus, and those are all posted online, and you can find them on www.meru.org. You go there, on the right-hand side, there's a link to the archive of all of the eTauruses that we published. As it happens, the last one, number 66, deals with the geometry of linear and cyclic time, which is what this poster is talking about. And I recommend that you go and link on that particular eTaurus so that you can follow the discussion. Okay, this is the poster that I was pointing to. It's in eTaurus number 66. There is a teaching that in Gan Eden, were both the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. You find those things talked about as both being not the same, and yet there's a quote that says, both trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, are in the midst of the garden, quote, end quote. How can that be? Are there two trees or what? And so Stanley was exploring this. And here is what he had to say about that. He notes first that the name of Eden, spelt in Hebrew Ayin Dalet and final Nun, is spelled exactly the same as one of the Hebrew words meaning time. There are two aspects to time: linear progressive time and cyclic time. The coming of self-awareness in the story of the Garden of Eden includes awareness of both the aging process, which is linear progressive time, and the cyclicity of all things in the natural world. Linear time correlates with evolution and the flow of loving kindness. In our experience, linear time is unidirectional. It extends from the past to the present to the future. Cyclic time, on the other hand, corresponds to the cycles of nature and life in the cosmos. The moon orbits the earth orbits the sun orbits the galaxy, and the seasons follow one after another in cyclic order. Cyclic time flows in a circle and points in all possible directions in its space. Each time a process returns to the same part of its cycle, it marks off the progress of linear time. Okay, now going up the poster. Oh my, there's just so much in this one.
Right. Well, let's look at this as a geometric metaphor that you started out with. I mean, obviously, if you have taken geometry, you see some familiar shapes and symbols, correct?
Yeah, and it's important to note about this particular triangle, it's important to note in a slightly different context that this is not this is a triangle where each of the sides is the same length. No, actually it's not. That's the point. Where the vertical line and the horizontal line are the same length. This is not an equilateral triangle. Yeah, there we go. On the left-hand side, where it says 53 degrees. And that's important in a slightly different context. If you've read our book, it's the section about the delta function, which is a somewhat more mathematically inclined geometric metaphor that my husband used very frequently, that I won't go into here, but I recommend, if you have the book, going back to those pages and thinking about it, because one thing I have discovered about living with this particular metaphor is that it provides a way of looking at life as it happens around me, and provides a perspective of understanding what's going on that I have found quite helpful. I'm going to read a quote, the one that's actually centered right there in the middle of this poster, which we found actually from the work of a friend who quoted a particular translation of Proclus's work on discussing Plato's Timaeus. Proclus was a philosopher, mathematician, I guess you could call it, in couple 3 centuries CE. I'm not sure the dates, but at any rate, this really stood out to us. The quote is, "Things have a twofold nature. The one invisible, unique, simple, and unworldly, and the other visible, multipled, varied, and distributed throughout the world. There are two kinds of energy, the one primordial, immovable, and intellectual, the other secondary, kinetic, and revolving in relation to the intellect. The one is free from cause and effect. The other contains them. It's that last line that's the most profound and the most important and the most clearly related to the way we think about things. That the transcendent, where miracles come from, where the flow of loving kindness that sustains our universe originates, if you can even say such a thing, is free from cause and effect, by definition. The other, the world as we know it, the what goes around comes around world, the wheel of karma world, contains cause and effect. And the interplay between these two motivators of our lives gives great insight and great wisdom if you start thinking about it. And I think I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, let's first of all, I want to reiterate something I said last time about looking at Stan being able to look at things in multi-dimensional manners, because here you're seeing what's called the inverted T, and that would I believe would be considered a one-dimensional view, whereas this could be looked at as a two-dimensional view. And here the other thing is I've talked many times about the need to animate this, because again, this represents movement. These are not static things. They all represent processes that we need to be able to show. And so that's one of our goals, is to get this moving through animation. Daniel or Michael, do you have any comments on this topic?
Levanah started off by talking about the definition of geometry and not to be scared of it. Let me talk about the word metaphor,
Okay.
and not be scared of that.
Mm-hmm.
Proclus and Abraham and a host of other people who were visionaries throughout history experienced something that was not of this world, that they could see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. That's the world of geometry, stuff you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, whether it's solid geometry or two-dimensional geometry. To say something is a metaphor for that doesn't mean that it's an equivalent of that. It's a way of trying to get our head around it, because words are terrible things. Because as soon as it comes out of your mouth, it's perceived differently, because everybody has their own body of experiences. So if you're a musician, you're going to hear this as music. If you're a dancer, you're going to feel it as dance. If you're a mathematician, you're going to see it in numbers and shapes. If you're a mystic, you're going to see it in, to talk about something that is one, the one is free from cause and effect. It's primordial, immovable, and intellectual. If you're religious, or you come from a spiritual background, you're going to say, oh, that's God. Okay, 3 letters already covers 2 sentences. And yet, even God, if I say God, everybody who's listening today is hearing something different, because that's their experience with something divine, whatever it is, outside of the see, hear, smell, taste, and touch stuff. That's where we spend most of our waking time. If we pray, if we dream, if we meditate, if we're lucky and we're meant to, then we tap into something higher. But it doesn't mean it's the same thing, because all of these are just metaphors that somebody with a certain experience and a certain vocabulary use to define something that you can't define. And even when it is something that you can define, it's still tricky, because I may say, oh, I like my metaphor better than yours, therefore I'll kill you. And human history in a nutshell. Okay, everybody's fighting with metaphors, and therein, I think, lies. It's good that we have metaphors to help us grasp something. It's bad that we have metaphors because we begin to equate metaphor with what is reflected in the metaphor. Geometry, I could not look at stuff the way that Stan looked at it. So because he saw things that way, his metaphor goes that way. Nor could I create the incredible music that Dan creates, that Dan creates, because I just don't have that vocabulary. And that makes it tough. I remember a Star Trek where they were trying to get into an enclosed space to find the computer that was running the show, whatever it was, and nobody could figure out the alphabet. And then Spock figures out that, well, these are not letters or words like pictograms, hieroglyphics, they're notes. Once he realized they were notes, he was able to play the right notes and open the closed chamber. So I guess I get lost in those metaphors too, because my metaphors come from my experience. And when we talk, I can sort of get some experience from what little music I know from what Dan is talking about. But then there was one tape that I watched where he was explaining how he created the Genesis piece that he was writing. And he was talking about thirds and fifths. And I thought, I don't know what he's talking about. I know that this chord is a C and this chord is an F. That much I know. So for those of you that are scared of geometry, don't be scared of metaphors. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you have the truth. It means you have, if that metaphor talks to you, then that's a way for you to understand it. If it doesn't talk to you, move on to another metaphor.
But when you're talking about geometric metaphor, however, there's more, I think there's more objectivity because, again, it's mathematically oriented. And mathematics is kind of a universal language, as is music, but music is expressed, and thus for it affects our feelings, and then we're going to have opinions about it. But when you're talking about geometric metaphor, and again, I'm not an expert on this subject, and I've always, it's always been a challenge to follow the concept. But I'm just thinking in terms of the mathematical aspects of Stan's work, and what made it so important that he was able to take these ancient ideas and language and concepts and put it in this form, or be able to express it, or show us how to express it in this form. Now, we're not mathematicians, at least I'm not, and in fact, it was my worst subject. Cool. I was on the other side.
And that's why you work at the Apple store. Well, I mean, really?
No, but also it's why it took me so long to grasp this after I met Stan. I mean, I could say it was 10 years before I was able to really put it together. But I came from it from the other side, from the more philosophical, historical, cultural perspective. But Stan,
I'd like to add something though.
Yeah, let me just finish.
Okay.
But Stan was not talking. I didn't feel Stan was talking to me. He always said he wanted to talk. His motivation was to reach people like himself, who had that way of looking at the world. And so it didn't leave us out, but it was more of a challenge for us to grasp it. Go ahead, Levanah.
Yeah, well, just responding to that, this was at a particular point of time when he very much wanted colleagues, people that he could actually work with. He was, as he grew shorter and shorter in his projected lifespan, let's put it that way, he was more and more focused on trying to find people who could actually interact with him on a level that would allow the work itself to progress. And I think that's kind of a natural thing that happens as you age. The thing about mathematics and that, the kind of geometric metaphor and thinking in terms of geometry that Stanley did with all of this material, what it does lend that anything having to do, anything expressed in words doesn't, is a certain amount of, it's two things. One is some precision, because there is an exactness to mathematics, and there's also, at least to mathematicians, a certain beauty in something which is elegant, and a way of expressing something that embodies many different things in a precise and organized way. And the other aspect of that is that once he had a structure in which he saw various aspects of a certain idea, then if there were spaces missing in that structure, it gave him a clue as to where to look to expand on the idea, to find new ways of viewing the relationship. So it's both a structure for things that you've already found, and a way of suggesting directions in which to look for things that you haven't yet spotted. And for him and for people who have that kind of good relationship with three-dimensional things, which he did have. He was a model builder.
That's
He,
right.
all of the models that you see him holding in the older videotapes, he made.
Right.
So he was very good with stuff. And like I said, it provides a way of saying, oh, there's something missing here. What can I do to refine this, to make it more elegant so that something isn't missing? If you go through the book, dealing with the idea of his autocorrelation, the first verse of Genesis, just as an example. I mean, first he saw a pattern that was linear. Then he said, oh, okay, well, maybe toroidal, two torus, he'll bend it around like that. But then, when he was trying to arrange the letters, there were like what they would call, there were spaces that were missing. He was trying to fill in spaces according to a certain pattern that he was figuring was the most optimal pattern for coordinating the letters. And people kept asking him, well, what about the missing spaces? And he said, well, okay, what about those missing spaces? And that's when he came up with the pattern, which in the book we call the Shushan flower, which I think has only 2 spaces that are empty. He never got beyond that, but that's a way in which using the geometric framework that he started to use pointed him in a very productive direction by trying to find out, trying to figure out how to correct what was incomplete about the metaphor as he first viewed it. So I think that's all I have to say on that topic.
Can I insert a little historic perspective that Stan actually brought up? There's no, I don't know if there's documentation for this, but the assumption is that by the time the Jews were in Greece, that they had already developed this tradition of hand gestures, and it was probably came originally from the Kohanim, the priests, and they had some structure for it. The theory is that while the group of rabbis could have been called the Sanhedrin, I'm not sure, were in Greece, there was a connection with the Greek mathematicians, specifically Pythagoras, that there was a connection between the rabbis and Pythagoras, that in some ways, this is where geometry was born. And at least the way we know it today, that it was, now it was, there was a way of expressing it three-dimensionally in terms of relationships. And of course, then what happened was the Greeks then took it and turned it into idol worship and made gods from these ideas. And that's when the rabbis had to break away from that. So it's an interesting historical perspective on how it's possible that this preceded geometry, but then was part of the development of the actual study of geometry.
Yeah, there are a couple of legends, legendary references to the possible interaction that we found. And no documentation,
No,
obviously.
there's no documentation. It's definitely theory. So, Michael, did you have another comment?
No, I was just going to say, I think you were talking about how it took 10 years before you began to really wrap your head around it. But what I was saying earlier, that whatever the body of information, whatever our hard drive holds, is how we relate to the world. If somebody puts a new piece in there, it begins to allow us to, as Levanah described, fill in the spaces. And we all have one common thing. We all start out with a base of the world we live in. It's the geometrical.
Mm-hmm.
But even the mathematicians, when they begin talking about higher dimensions, could just as easily be talking metaphysics as physics.
Mm-hmm.
And they get closer and closer together. And
in
so
classical times they were.
Yes. And science said, no, this is where we draw the line. I mean, there were a lot of things, for example, in the 1930s, when the pharmaceutical companies took over the medical schools, all the stuff that was around, working with light and working with magnets and working with all kinds of folk medicine things that had been working fine, and herbal stuff. But if it wasn't the pharmaceuticals, it was removed from the curriculum of the medical schools. It was determined. It was an actual, I forget what year it was, I think it was 32 or something like that, where they actually changed the general curriculum for medical schools and said, this is now out and this is now in. And that's the trouble. I think the best place to always start is something physical, because we all have a grasp of it. From the time we're a baby, we're negotiating a physical world. As soon as we jump up to that next dimension, we'll call it space and hyperspace. As soon as we jump into hyperspace, all the bets for regular space are off. Quantum physics is not physics. There are different rules in quantum physics, because it's talking about the very small and the very large. Well, in the very small world, there are a gazillion particles that don't follow Newtonian physics, which is the middle, the middle ground, not the very big, just what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And that's the challenge of this.
Well, starting with something physical is what the hand model does. And
yes,
it's a good way to start, because you can actually feel it and put it on. Daniel, did you have a comment on this topic?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, geometric metaphor. I think there's, if you look at it the following way, like let's posit that we have souls that embody a physical world, right? And that there's that we forget our previous understanding. We come into the world with a sense of things oftentimes, but not entirely knowing what any of this means. And we develop meanings based on our predilections and based on our experience. And every meaning that a person has, no matter what, from the lowest level of meaning to the highest, all has to do in this world with geometric metaphor. So let's take a person whose deepest meaning is that they like drinking and they like getting drunk, right? Just kind of a low level, let's say, but it's something. At least they like something. So they see this bottle, right? And they drink it. Now, sometimes they're not really drinking it for the taste. They're drinking it to get to a place where they have assigned a certain kind of inner meaning or feeling, right? So the bottle actually,
or no feeling,
or no feeling, or whatever that state is, that bottle and that thing represents that to them, right? And so,
Are you saying that you use spirits to find your spirit?
no, I'm just saying, even on a low level, even someone who's addicted is looking for some sort of meaning or something more than, right? And they get it from this thing, which is unhealthy and can destroy their lives and those around them, if they're addicted. And so there's that's a whole nother conversation about.
Well, are you saying that the bottle represents the geometric metaphor for reaching that particular feeling, just like we're saying the hand model is a way of learning?
Right. So let's say we go from that person who's addicted and on a pretty, struggling with life in this world. I'm not judging. I'm saying it's a struggle and they're having problems. Their level of meaning, however low it may be, is still a level of geometric metaphor. So let's jump from that level to then when we're dealing with Stan. Now, and in between, I think there's lots of gradations, but Stan was dealing with, and I think I have this right, like it's fundamental geometries and like how they embody or represent a much deeper level of meaning. And I think that's where he kind of lived is taking these fundamental ideas of geometry and exposing their kind of essence and the meaning that they held for him, and the universal meaning as it's seen through Torah and through Jewish spirituality and through almost a universal, I would say, definitely a universal level of spirituality. So and so it's kind of like, again, it's like, and obviously he lived in the physical world, but his level of meaning and these concepts are kind of at the deepest level of geometric meaning. So again, you take the drunk person who's got the bottle and that means something to them, or me, I have a violin or whatever it is that I derive meaning from, or I wrote something and it's on paper and then people play it, and those are all geometric things happening that hold tremendous meaning for me, right? And so, but then when you're talking about the work of Meru, it's at this fundamental, like deep kind of deep or highest level, however you want to say it, level of meaning and finding meaning in the world.
Well, that's the beauty of it. You can see it at all different levels. You can see it at the base level, at the physical level, and then the higher dimensional level. And I think that's how we reach a relationship with the higher dimensional level, through comparing it to what we see and feel and touch to what exists in a place where we can't physically see, but we know it's there. And I think that's kind of what Michael's teaching in his classes. Before we go, I don't want to lose time. So let's jump to Michael so he can review a poster that he chose. And first of all, what is the poster? And I want to refer to the page number it is in the book.
Okay, well, there is sort of two. Let me preface, when you said, think of a poster that really talks to you, and take that one because there's so many choices in the book. And Stan was the one who told me which to pick, I have to say. I only knew him for a relatively short time before he graduated. And he kept saying, I hadn't even finished the book and I was reaching out to talk to him. I said, I got to talk to this guy because I got the shape and I got the letters and I got this whole thing. And it's like we're talking about the same thing. We're just looking at it from two directions. And he said, did you read the last chapter? He doesn't mean the epilogue. I said, I didn't get there. He says, read the last chapter, read the last chapter, read the last chapter. And he said it took me a while because, as you start to get into that physics, you slow down. It's like you've just come into a construction zone and you got to work a little slower. And there were two that really, really talked to me. One was on page 256, which is, let me share the screen with that one, which is this one. And as I read the explanation of what this was, I didn't totally get the physics of it, but what I got from it was that this area right here, and that's the hypercube or hyperspace or whatever, the more of these physical ones you put in it. So you're in, every circle's got to touch the edge. So 4 of them can touch the edge here, and this one's got to be tangent to all of them, and they all have to touch. And then if you were to increase it to 8, and then 16, and keep on going, it's as if you're increasing dimensions. Well, that's where he began to lose me a little bit. But the one thing I saw was that this, which I saw as the soul, the spark of the soul inside the body, got bigger and bigger the higher the dimensions until it reached the 10th dimension, and then became bigger than that which contained it.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, all of meditation and all of spiritual aspirations is trying to get, like, for temporarily to leave your obsession and attachment to the physical and try and move up higher. And the breaking point was 10 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, that's really cool, particularly because of the minion being the minimum required for a quorum group. And it is at that point, which use the expression, this section of the book is called something like New Emergent Consciousness or something like that.
Yeah, it's called Principles of Interpretation, Part 2, Emergence.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's in that emergent thing, and it's moving toward, and he kept saying this over and over again as well, that it's moving toward a new consciousness. And that talked to me. Yeah, on page 273 is the beginning of a section that explains my second diagram here, which is on 277. But his explanation of it, I'm going to move the pictures of us away. Here we start with, over here, what we've been talking about, that there's an emergence, and that's a physics term as he uses it, that you reach a certain point where some emergent phenomenon, something happens, and when it does, we move into a different level. So Hashem, God, is up here, and this is our world down here, whether you do it this way, or this way. And this is the one that really got me, the Bose Einstein Condensate, which I had never heard of and had no idea what it was. But what this is explained as, when he's talking about this, really talked to me, because he was saying is the possibility for a transformation of human consciousness, an actual change of attitude and intention in the human community at large, something to fix the world. And the first example he gave, I'm going to stop the share for 1 second. The first example he gave were like birds and fish and bees that would move independently. Let's take birds. And all of a sudden, when there's a 10th bird, something happens. Even though each bird has a different attitude of its wing, different direction, they all begin to fly in a flock. And the bees begin to move in a shape, and fish begin to swim in a school, and they don't bang into each other. And here, really using as a metaphor, he said that analogy. Now, what happens in that drawing is that you have a bunch of particles, and you need a proper alignment of a group of 10 or more persons. This can help illustrate the consciousness when 10 or more people get together with this in a same kind of consciousness. In physics, this is known as superfluidity. In material, cooled to absolute zero. So what happens is there's a whole bunch of particles, and you bring, following the uncertainty principle, down to near almost absolute zero, or to absolute zero. And then something miraculous happens. The wave function of each of these particles come together, and they emerge with a new shape. And that's called this condensate. From that point on, the mass of the formerly independent particles now moves together as a single body. And he compares that chilling out of going to absolute zero with utter humility, with chilling out of the individual ego. So, and it's not saying stop being who you are. Each of those particles is what it is. Like each of the 10 people has different attitudes and different ideas. But instead of being focused on their own, they begin to focus on a collective purpose and they chill out their egos, even though each one's different. And on some level, I imagine this as an orchestra because every instrument sounds different, but somehow when the right combination gets together, they make music. But they got to be tuned to the same zero place, because if you don't tune to the oboe, you're going to make a lot of noise. But if you tune to the oboe, you make music. And he quotes Chaim Vital, the Ari, the great mystic's second in command, who wrote most of his stuff down. And he said, this is the idea of that image. And I'll read it's the very last section right before the notes. I'll just put the picture back up again. And he writes, the same symbolic structures that provide key to, well, no, let me start before that. The combination of individuals in a group in proper alignment promises the coming into being of possibilities that may seed and influence the entirety of life on Earth. Thus, the same symbolic structures that provide a key to the gesture of the alphabet and so forth, and the text of Genesis and beyond, when interpreted correctly, show the transformation of our very humanity in our time. That human beings can form a circle and not bang into each other and run around the base of the mountain killing each other because somebody else has a truth that's different in words than theirs is, or in metaphor than theirs is, but rather it comes together and creates a healing minion. And it involves the golden rules and so forth, which is what we're using to chill out in. Okay, that to me is a perfect metaphor for Jewish meditation and healing. And I think that's why, after I told him what I do, that he said, read the last chapter, because he knew that's where my metaphorical model was. And he said, I'm giving you some great extra metaphors to explain it. I'm giving you the Bose Einstein condensate. I don't know who Bose was, but Einstein was Jewish, so I figure we're halfway there. Okay, he's giving us this incredible model. It's not actually what's happening. Well, maybe it is on some energy, high dimensional level that we reach the 10th dimension. I don't know if you remember where minion comes from. God said to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, what if I can find 50 righteous people? He says, but you couldn't. And he looked, couldn't find them. So he went to 40 and 30 and 20 and 10. He said, if you don't find 10, that's it. That's the bottom line. It's 10 people in 10 dimensions, all of them with the same consciousness of love and healing. That's not easy to do. That's not easy to do. They have to tune to the same note. And this model just blew my head because I totally related it to something that I was totally absorbed in. I wasn't absorbed in physics. So I understood the model enough. I read that paragraph about 400 times over and over again. And each time I found a nuance in it that said, yeah, I get it. Because for me, that consciousness, that global consciousness is what it was about. And healing was what it was about. So that's why I picked those two. One to get the soul big, and then one to join with other souls like that on that hyperspatial level, whatever that means, to join together.
If you want to hear Stan talking about what Michael just discussed in that poster on www.meruvideo.com, there's 3 videos that we call the video companions to Alphabet That Changed the World. We recorded Stan's voice and then added the graphics to it. Episode 2, Form Follows Function, at the end, Stan discusses this specific poster that Michael was referring to. Levanah, you had a comment?
Yeah, I've got two comments actually. One of them goes back to that drawing of the little red ball going up to 10 dimensions, because actually, what that little red circle and then ball actually is the empty space in the center. And your identification with the soul made me cross connect with the tabernacle. And that,
Yes.
in fact, at the center, it's empty, so called.
Mm.
There's
Yeah,
no.
between the wings of the cherubs, that's
Yeah.
where the priest
And-
heard, the high priest heard God's voice from that silence.
Yeah, and that in the structure that they were instructed to build, that what was at its center, at its heart, was empty space. Space. There was no thing in there. So that you identify that with the soul really kind of triggered my click, 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 click. Thing.
There's a teaching, a Hasidic teaching. I
Right.
know the Kedushat Levi brings, we love Yitzchak Berditchev, the great master, brings that the tabernacle is the body, and he lays out how the tabernacle, how the temple actually is our bodies, and that the divine presence is our soul. That the two are it's meant to be a geometric metaphor for our lives, and we're supposed to see the tabernacle and then embody that same concept in how we live.
Hey, Daniel, did you have a poster you wanted to discuss? I don't want to run out of time here. Okay, Levanah, you have one more point.
Yeah, I have one more comment, right, related to what Michael was saying, actually, two slightly more comments, one of which is a related little tiny poster, which is on page, right, page 259, The Emergence of a Miracle. The Hebrew word for assembly is Knesset, as most of us who pay any attention to the news kind of realize. But in the middle of that word is also the word nes, nun samek, and that word means miracle. So if you think about it, this is the novelty, the injection of novelty, into the circle of our lives as we know it. That's the nes in the middle of the Knesset. And one final thing here, which is also related to the poster. It's a quote that Stanley used very, very often with regards to this particular idea that I want to read. This is a quote which we found in a book by a contemporary or last generation historian who was recapitulating what Chaim Vital, whom we just mentioned, on the subject of love among the companions. And this is with regards to, you'll get it from the paragraph. The idea that love must prevail among the companions, in other words, the people who are in this group, this Knesset, and who must be letting go of their ego, letting go of their self-absorption. The idea that love must prevail among the companions was not confined by Lurianic Kabbalah to the theoretical speculative realm, and did not apply only to Rabbi Akiva's disciples. Luria himself took pains to ensure that love would prevail among the members of his group. Before worshiping in the synagogue, an individual had to commit himself to the mitzvah of loving one's fellow, so that all of the prayers of Israel would be combined together. Especially important, writes Chaim Vital, was the love of companions who study Torah together. Each of them must regard himself as though he were one part of the body of the group of his companions, especially if he has the knowledge and understanding to know his fellow soul. And my teacher cautioned me greatly about the need for love to prevail among the companions in our group. I'm thinking also about that last phrase, especially if he has the knowledge and understanding to know his fellow soul. What that implies, if you look kind of underneath the words, is that this Knesset, this group, doesn't have to and certainly won't always include people of the same level of understanding or maturity or health or anything. It just simply implies that, first of all, everyone must give what they can, allow what they can, drop their ego as they can, and particularly pointing out that those who really are gifted in this area need to make sure that they give what they can too, so that even though maybe the input might seem uneven, by the time you get to this pool, this Knesset, everything is shared. Everything is in touch. Everything is communicating. And then the nes, the miracle can happen. It may not always. It's up to the miracle itself. But nonetheless, that creates space for it. Again, back to the idea of space. Okay.
Okay.
I have
Okay.
two quick thoughts. Can I give you two quickies? They're real quick.
All right.
I promise. Okay. Even one quickie. When I turned to this page, as I was reading, I made a note on the bottom of the page. And I thought of it as kind of a, just, you know, how you make notes. And I don't have the same volume you do. I have ones with pink pieces of paper stuck out of them, not yellow ones like you do, Bill. But the letter kaf of the word Knesset is palm of the hand. And taf, the last letter, is the last letter of the 22-letter alphabet. Aleph represents unity, singularity, and taf represents multiplicity. In other words, taf is often thought of as like everybody. And if everybody came together to hold a miracle, so I wrote, let us make a circle to hold a miracle, was the entire word Knesset, taking all of the stuff I had done with the shapes of the letters up to that point in the book. That was my one prayer. The other point was that a miracle is just something that science hasn't figured out yet.
Yeah.
It has emerged from a higher place. Eventually, look, we're talking on Zoom. I mean, this is a miracle. Yeah. It's a miracle. But now we understand how to do it. So it's not just the medicine men who are doing it or the witches getting burned at the stake. It's everybody's got a phone and everybody can do it. Same thing here. Let us also make a circle to hold a miracle.
The nun is kind of the connector of those two letters. When you think of the nun in the center of the kaf and the
well, the samach is the circle. Yeah, it's a great word.
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about it in so many different ways.
Two things. Kanes means to get together and also to go into something.
Yeah, lehikanes. Yeah.
So Daniel, do you have a poster that you would like to discuss, or are you just kind of?
Well, I mean, this Gan Eden, the Gan Eden poster really is the one that just, you know, I mean, I've seen so many posters, and I'm so honored to have seen so many posters of one of the first people to see them, and just, it's like always like I would sit and look and just kind of meditate on them and, you know, get different things out of them. And so there's, in my memory, there's a lot of them, but this one really just, we said, oh, what's the poster? I thought, oh, the Gan Eden poster. You know what I mean? That's somehow like poof. Gan Eden, you know, Eden really, if you think about that which is pleasurable, it's always has to do with concealment and then something being revealed, whatever it is. You know, whether you go to a restaurant and you order and you're just looking at these words, okay, I'll have the whatever, you know, and then it comes and it's revealed. And I mean, hopefully it's a good restaurant, you But there's a concealment and a revealment, and then you have pleasure from that. Everything like that with pleasure is like that. The thing about Aiden, the word Aiden, it's like the doorway of vision, the aid, right? When you give testimony, you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu. When you say the Shema, the ayin and the dalet are big because it spells out aid, which means witness. It means you've seen something, you've experienced something. So a real vision is not just, like I had some crazy vision and like, wow, let's see if we can. A real vision is like you actually saw something. You're giving testimony. You're seeing something. So in the concept of Aiden is this concept of like it goes on forever. The vision keeps going forever and ever. The amount of pleasure of what was concealed becomes revealed, and what was concealed becomes revealed. Just goes on and on and on in a cycle. And I think that's kind of why we have these two the cyclical nature and then the linear nature. The cyclical nature is again concealed and revealed and concealed and revealed, and that hints at cyclical time and linear time. I mean, both hint at these two simultaneous processes. It's so amazing what he did here. The cyclical though has to do with these deeper relationships, these foundational relationships. That like so there's the cyclical nature of the world we live in, or worlds, or whatever we live in. And the different relationships that make those cycles, but then there's inside of those cycles, there's something even more. And I think when you look at the Kabbalah and you look at the system of Sfirot, those are these foundational relationships that everything else kind of flows out of. And I think Stan was a real visionary in that he saw how this works or how this expresses itself in the kind of foundations of geometry. And that's it.
Well, that fits into the poster that I chose. And it's this one here. This was on page 337. It is on page 337. It's actually an appendix M. I'm going to discuss or show this portion of it. I kind of am cheating because I actually animated this about, I don't know how many years now. This is rudimentary animation, folks. I did it all in Photoshop. And the dialogue is all from Stan. Tree of Abraham, an organic model of Western civilization, illustrates the intrinsic cyclic relationship among the three Abrahamic covenants. This is the flow of civilization and time, moving from a metaphoric Jewish seed through a metaphoric Christian tree to a metaphoric Islamic fruit. We also have all three traditions as three phases of life, together at the same time in our time. The conceptual phase is identified with Judaism, the gestational phase with Christianity, and the letting go, birthing phase with Islam. Of course, each of these phases of faith must include the other two, because this is all happening at once, right now. just as it is also happening eternally, cyclically, and throughout history. Life grows both ways. Life grows sequentially in time, and it grows spread out in different organs within an organism at any given time. All right, so I don't have to say much more about that. These posters that we talked about, or any of the information, if you'd like copies of any of the posters, we gave the page numbers, or you can identify it. You can email me at meruwest@gmail.com, and in the subject just say Meru posters, and I can send you JPEGs of anything that you saw. They're also obviously available online and in our book. Any final comments? I think we've covered a lot of information today. If not, we will see you next time, hopefully, and thanks for joining us, and take it easy.